I want to run through the Wanderer poem, which is kind of funky. It demonstrates many of the elements you get in Old English poetry, but it does it in a smaller, kind of compact. Well, we'll just go through it kind of quickly. It's a little bit easier to read than Beowulf because it's so short, but it demonstrates all the elements that you get in Beowulf in a pocket-sized version. It was put together in print or in a written form around the year 1000 ish. They're never quite sure of the dates of these medieval poems. They're not sure. It may have been written down at this time, but when was it composed? And there are serious elements of, was somebody messing with it, adding things? And those are issues. Not so much with this, but with any documents, really anything written before 1400, you gotta wonder, okay, was it messed with? Did somebody add something because they wanted to promote a certain idea? And if I can just change this, and when it's written down, I'll just add some of my own lines. And they could have done that. We don't know, okay? I've read interpretations that say the Wanderer is all one writer, one poet. I've read interpretations that say it clearly has things interjected into it. I believe it has elements that are interjected. I believe that. But that's based on my history with reading Roman text, where they did a lot of that kind of stuff. Okay, so let me jump in and kind of show you a little bit of it so you're aware of it. And I got to emphasize, there's a great deal of uncertainty in here. Okay, it's historical ambiguity. It's an ambiguity that does not seem to be designed by the poet. It's an ambiguity that comes with the historical text, which you're not certain about this element or that element, and to say it's this or that is with any certainty is just a fantasy, because we can't really tell yet. Okay, let me shrink myself up, and I'm sitting on right here, right above me, is an ancient, one of the original versions of the Exeter text. This is what it looked like. Okay, that's the Old English, and that you can't read that. So that's, well, at least I can. If you can, I'll give you extra credit. But yeah, Old English is tough, and it was written down in Old English. And let me go through some of these passages. And notice again, it's translated by Kennedy. And you can't read the Old English. It's very difficult. And it starts off this way, okay? It starts off with, oft to the wanderer, weary of exile, comes God's pity, compassionate love, regular rhythm, through woeful toiling on wintry seas. And Caesar just, it means there's a space in the text. With churning oar on the icy waves. What you're getting here is alliteration. Alliteration is this repetition of a sound. Oftentimes, it's a sound that's reflected in the poetry itself. Oft to the wanderer, weary of exile. That's kind of the W sound of the waves that he's talking about here again and again. Cometh God's pity, compassionate love, regular rhythm. So that rhythm that he's creating there, again and again with the P's and the C's, that's throughout. That's how the poetry works in Old English. I want to emphasize something, that it's kind of tough to rhyme German. And that's what Old English was. It's very difficult to rhyme German. If you want to get a poetic form, you're much more likely to rely on alliteration rather than rhyming. Rhyming just is really tough to do. It's easy if you're writing in Latin or Greek or Italian. Good luck in German. Okay, so they used alliteration rather than others, and then they built the syllables. If I click on the old text here, they built these syllables in these words. So it had a certain number of syllables with a certain number of stresses, and so it had a rhythm to it. And so alliteration, because it echoes a sound, worked with the alliteration, with the syllables, syllabication, and the stresses that were in the lines. So what we're used to in English is them rhyming the lines. What you see in Old English is alliteration and a construction or a rhythm built into it through the syllabication and the stressing. Okay, but notice this is kind of an outside frame to a story. This is a speaker telling you about when he met a wanderer. And so 95% of this is the wanderer's story. But this little segment at the top is somebody saying, I met this wanderer, basically. And so he says, homeless and helpless, he fled from fate. Okay, the alliteration is obvious. Thus saith the wanderer, merciful of misery, grievous disaster and death of kin. And so he's saying here that this wanderer is describing all the horrors and misery of living on your own after you've lost everything. Okay, and I'll tell you this on a little side note, that this poem has become very powerful in 20th century literature because it gets into elements that you see in existential literature and modernist poetry and other things, of this kind of wanting to belong and not really belonging, this kind of fractured sense of self. That is demonstrated in The Wanderer. We saw a good deal of this in modernist poetry after the First World War, that feeling of not belonging. And so what people did in the early 20th century is went back to poems like this to understand their own time period. Okay. Now, again, I want to emphasize, Chaucer did not read this. He could not. Okay. But the themes and elements in it were picked up by poets such as Ezra Pound and others. And again, J.R.R. Tolkien was one of the scholars of this type of work. Okay. And then in the next section, no man is living, no comrade left, to whom dare fully unlock my heart. And that is a metaphor of the heart is often compared to a chest where it holds things in, and so it isn't expressed. Grief isn't supposed to be expressed, it's supposed to be held in. And the metaphor of locking it is consistent throughout Old English poetry. Okay, and then he switches to this next section, and I want to emphasize that this seems to be quotation marks at every new paragraph. That's what it is. It's the same speaker throughout. Okay, the first speaker covers these opening 8 lines or so. And then the other one, the wanderer himself, starts up here. Okay, and then you have this section. So have I often in wretchedness fettered my feelings far from my kin. Again, it's fettering my feelings, is holding on to them, tying them down as if there's something you would tie down on a boat at sea. Okay, far from my kin, homeless and hapless, since days of old, and when the dark earth covered my dear Lord's face, and I sailed away with sorrowful heart over wintry seas, seeking a gold friend. Now, gold friend is, I've got it marked in the margin as a kenning. These are small little noun phrases, little segments of English. Again, noun phrases that describe a noun. It's a phrase that describes a noun, and they will be set poetically so that they follow a certain format. They often come up over and over again throughout the text. So they're often deployed because they already fit the poetic form that the poet's trying to use. Okay, and so that's what this does. But notice the solitude of the speaker. He is described in many parts of his poem as an almost ideal medieval warrior traveling from town to town. They're doing their thing, conquering this, conquering that. But now he's left entirely alone. Entirely alone. And this is, in a lot of ways, kind of demonstrative of what really is happening to Old English society. It's fading away. It hasn't been able to sustain itself. This style of living, this warrior culture, cannot go on. And so he's the result of it. His solitude is the result of it. Okay? And I'll just go ahead and jump up to the end just so you get an idea of what goes on here. No wonder, therefore, in all the world of shadow darkness upon my soul, when I reflect on the fates of men. Fate is a warrior notion. Okay, how one by one proud warriors vanish from halls that knew them, and day by day all the earth ages and droops unto death. And so this is not just his own solitude, but the ending of an entire way of life that's coming to its, overall it's just its demise. It's running out of steam. This is a world passing. His solitude is from this collapse of the entire medieval warrior culture. And then these odd things happen at the end, okay? And fate's decrees transform the world. Here wealth is fleeting, friends are fleeting, man is fleeting, kinsman is fleeting. Everything is leaving him behind. All of the values of Old English culture are leaving him behind. All the foundations of earth shall fail. Everything that made up the warrior culture is fleeting. That's personification. In other words, if they're running away, they're going away, they're leaving you alone. And so much the way the other warriors left him alone and the king left him alone, and it would have been more of a, not so much, what they didn't have were castles back then. They did not have those. And I know from, when you think of, a Hobbit and things like that, you might think of castle, but you might notice that they really don't have castles in it, because J.R.R. Tolkien knew that. The castles would come after the Norman conquest. He would bring those with him. Okay, the whole idea that you build a castle for ruling. They really lived in with a foundation of a tribal chief, a warlord running the show. Okay, but all of that is fleeting. And notice these last lines. This is the last thing I want to show you. And happy the man who seeketh for mercy from the Father in heaven, our fortress and strength. Was that added on, or was that part of the original? It seems kind of odd, because this hasn't really, this idea of mercy and everything else has not been, I don't really see it. And so again, I've seen critics say that this is consistent. I've seen others say that it's inconsistent. I believe it's inconsistent. That these last two lines, this couplet was added on when it was composed in writing. I don't believe it was part of the original, but I have no way to prove it. Okay, and that is something that we can demonstrate with earlier writings, Roman and Greek writings from around the year 0 or so, or 300 years before, 300 years after. It often demonstrates interjections where somebody added something. I think that's going on here, but I don't know. That's just an element of Old English poetry, and it's going to be an element. You're going to see it working out where things are kind of happening in Beowulf. Did somebody... And I've had discussions with other faculty, and we disagree over it. Beowulf will demonstrate some of these elements, but there's no way to prove it for certain that it was adjusted later on as it was composed. Was it composed as a clear Old English poem with no Christian elements? I think it almost certainly has those roots. But again, very important to understand that that Old English poem, if it existed as a distinct pagan poem, which I think it did, it survived and was passed down through early Christian society, and those Christian elements were added to it, okay? And that became the new poem. That's the way the poetry works. It reflects the society in which it lives. So whether or not it was added or not isn't actually that important. The fact is that around the year 1000, this was part of the element, part of the poetry, because it's part of what mattered to them. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and you figure it out as best you can, and then I'll pick this up with Beowulf. Take care, you guys.